It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, this is a free course for listeners by an expert on the local giveaways to corporations in your community.
That's right. And before we start, though, we want to pay tribute to a few people we've lost in the past couple of weeks. Some great people. And Ralph, you wanted to pay tribute to two in particular, Francis Golden and Nick Kotz. Tell us who they are.
Well, they've received wonderful obituaries given their life's commitment to public interest in the New York Times recently. Francis Golden was a remarkable civic activist in Lower Manhattan for decades. She took on Robert Moses, who wanted to bulldoze huge areas of the Lower East Side and dispossess all these people, saying it's a blighted neighborhood. And she beat him with a coalition, which was unheard of. I mean, Robert Moses was like the unelected dictator of development in New York City. She started a literary agency representing a lot of good authors, and she was just indefatigable in heralding the cause of people who were maliciously prosecuted and put away for a long time in jail, wrongfully convicted, which is more than a few around the country. So Francis Golden should have a biography written of her. Anybody's listening, anybody knows someone who's doing a PhD in history or sociology or economics, it'd be a great biography. She touched a lot of bases, and we can't do justice to her life now, but a biography can.
And tell us about Nick Kotz.
Nick Kotz was the bureau chief for the Des Moines Register in Washington, D.C., and I walked into his office one day at the Press Club building, and I said, Nick, you know, the Washington Post's not interested in dirty meat and poultry plants, but coming from Iowa, you should be. So I gave him what I had in terms of evidence, and he took it from there, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. And that caught the attention of the Washington Post that hired him, and he went on to even higher journalistic achievements. And after he left the Post, he became an author on some very important civil rights issues, the collaboration, for example, between Martin Luther King and President Lyndon Johnson, and other books. And he was just a marvelous person all around, and it was tragic the way he lost his life. He put his old Mercedes in neutral and went to get something in the back seat, and the car rolled back and struck him. We're going to miss Nick, and our condolences to Mary.
And Ralph, I noticed in the obituary in the New York Times, there was a picture that featured Nick Kotz and you talking with Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle.
Right. Nick's articles and our advocacy in Congress got the meat and poultry inspection laws passed, and Lyndon Johnson, namely his chief of staff, Joe Califano, invited Upton Sinclair in his latter years, who had written that novel in the early 20th century called The Jungle, that so many college students read. And it may have been a novel, but it was a very realistic description of the Chicago slaughtering yards and all the dirty meat and disgusting lack of sanitation. And that led to the early food and drug law that was passed. And so it was a conjunction of two historic eras. And it's very nice that the Times and Post used that article. Nick Kotz was there, Upton Sinclair, Lyndon Johnson. I was there as well at the signing ceremony.
And we also want to pay tribute to a good friend of the show who passed away last week at the age of 94, the indomitable Green Cowboy, S. David Freeman. David Freeman was actually the very first guest on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour back in 2014, and he was one of our most frequent guests. In fact, we last spoke with him on the program less than a month ago in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. He was an engineer, an author, an advocate for clean, safe energy, an administrator who ran public utilities, including the great Tennessee Valley Authority, and he advised many presidents on these issues from Kennedy to Carter. In his obituary, the New York Times quoted one of his favorite expressions, quote, "Any fool can buy an umbrella on a rainy day. It takes a wise man to buy an umbrella on a sunny day." Ralph, you knew him for a long time.
Well, he was one great American. He really is one of the kind. Age 94, we lost him. And he was a lawyer, an engineer. He did everything. He was scholarly. He headed the classic Ford Foundation report in the early 70s called The Time to Choose to Move to Renewable Energy and Efficiency. And then he was advising President Carter, who appointed him to head the Tennessee Valley Authority, where he closed down several nuclear plants as being costly boondoggles and replaced the energy with programs on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And then he was really off to the races. He went to Sacramento, closed a nuclear plant there that was disfavored by public referendum, and replaced it with renewable energy and efficiency. And he did the same thing in the area of Los Angeles. Then he went to upstate New York at the request of the first Governor Cuomo and ran a utility there. And right up until the end, he was negotiating the closing of the last nuclear plant in California with the Pacific Gas and Light Electric Company. There's just nothing like him. He was critical of the big environmental groups for being too timid, too limited, too much talk, not enough action. He wanted to reduce by law 5% a year the use of fossil fuels. It's the only way to do it. He said they're poisoning the planet, and we've got to reduce 5% a year until we become all electric, supported by renewable energy and a much more efficient utilization of energy from the generating source right down to people's homes and appliances. And I thought one of his best phrases, Steve and David, was he said, "Mother Nature doesn't care about what people say. Mother Nature only cares about what people do."
That's right. And at the end of the program, we're going to play a number of clips from past shows that illustrate the wit, wisdom, and progressive vision of S. David Freeman, the Green Cowboy. So stick around for that. In the meantime, we're going to once again feed your brain with another provocative show that deals with our current economic situation from a couple of different angles. As part of the 2020 Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, aka the CARES Act, airlines received a $25 billion bailout, yet small businesses aren't getting a whole lot of this aid. These massive corporate handouts are being justified in the name of jobs. It is not new for corporations to receive taxpayer subsidies in the name of jobs, and more often than not, these promises of jobs are left unfulfilled. Corporations get away with this again and again, and in fact are clamoring now for legal immunity from being sued if anyone gets sick on their job. Our first guest, Greg LeRoy, who is the founder of the watchdog group Good Jobs First, is going to shed some light on what is really in these stimulus packages and tell us how states can end the corporate giveaways hidden inside. And we all know what a sales tax is. You buy a shirt in a store and you have to pay a few dollars extra in tax. It differs slightly from state to state, but everybody pays the same tax on the shirt, whether you're rich or poor. One state, New York State, is currently experiencing a $13 billion deficit. So our second guest, New York State Assemblyperson Phil Steck, proposes that the solution is to reinstate the stock transfer tax. This tax would essentially be a sales tax on stocks. It would be a pittance, anywhere from a penny to a nickel, depending on the type of transfer. This tax, if reinstated, could bring in $13 billion a year for New York State. Who could possibly be against this? Well, we'll find out in the second half of the show. And as always, somewhere in between, we'll take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have some time left over, we'll try to answer some listener questions. But first, let's talk about how to end corporate handouts. David?
Greg LeRoy is the executive director of Good Jobs First, a leading watchdog of state and local economic development subsidies. Mr. LeRoy founded Good Jobs First back in 1998. This organization created COVID Stimulus Watch, which monitors where CARES Act assistance is going. Mr. LeRoy authored the book, The Great American Job Scam, Corporate Tax Dodging, and the Myth of Job Creation. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Greg LeRoy.
Thanks so much. Great to be with y'all.
Thanks very much, Greg. And a prefatory note to our listeners, none of these corporate freeloaders would ever dare debate Greg LeRoy. And you'll see why in the next few minutes. He's going to talk about local and state giveaways, subsidies, handouts, you name it, that bleed the school budgets and other necessary budgets at the local and state level. He has a website that can answer your question as to whether these subsidies are in California, New York, Illinois, Kentucky, and so all this will be backed up. So consider this a free, short course in corporate giveaways that are all over the country in varying degrees, and they don't even fulfill often the purposes for which they're given away by lobbied state and local public officials. Let's start with one, Greg, which came to my attention in a stunning way. When MSNBC was set up, the question between General Electric and Microsoft, who are the two co-owners of this new cable program, was whether they're located in New York City or be lured to New Jersey. And they were lured to New Jersey, where they are now, by a huge package of giveaways. One of them was so stunning that I don't know how they got away with it. And that was that the hundreds of employees working at MSNBC would be taxed on their income by New Jersey state income tax. And that money didn't go to New Jersey. It went to the two at the time most profitable companies in the country, General Electric, which owned NBC, and Microsoft. And as far as I know, it still continues. So what can you tell our listeners about stop paying taxes to the boss?
Yeah, that's a great example, and thanks so much for having me. So in about a third of the states, about 17 states, there are, quote, incentives, unquote, I'm putting air quotes around that word, that effectively mean workers, without their knowledge, without their consent, are paying state income taxes back to their boss. The money, or a big chunk of the money, about two-thirds of the money in the case of New Jersey, does not end up in the state treasury where everybody thinks it's going to support public services. Actually, at the end of the day, it's actually ending up in the pockets of their employers. We identified 2,700 companies that this was true of when we issued this study a while ago. One other state has enacted a giveaway like that since, Michigan, and of course it got taken advantage of by the gazillionaire Dan Gilbert there in Detroit. But it's, lots of other companies, big, rich banks and insurance companies and manufacturers and foreign-owned companies, frankly, have taken advantage of this too.
And you say in Kentucky, this program will cost about $31 million in fiscal year 2022. Indiana cost $85 million last year. So that gives you an idea of what you can raise in your own state here by way of challenging it before the state legislature or giving a good reporter some leads. Another one of your 10 is terminate subsidies to e-commerce, including Amazon. Amazon making money hand over fist is on the dole?
Absolutely. So Amazon gets big subsidies three different ways, but especially for its warehouses. It has more than 500 of them now. And its cloud computing data centers, or so-called server farms. And we make the point that, 8 years ago, Amazon flipped its business model, its prime business model, from low prices, including not collecting sales taxes, to rapid delivery, right? 2-day, 1-day, same day. And by doing that, they could no longer legally avoid collecting sales taxes in most states. And therefore, they had to build these warehouses and they had to start charging sales tax. But they also then started demanding subsidies, saying, hey, we're job creators. And I'm putting air quotes around that because we all know they're eating the lunch of the bricks and mortar retailers who are now going bankrupt left and right. And we don't need to subsidize Amazon as it gobbles up the retail market and monopolizes things, or data or cloud computing either. Nor should we do this for Walmart or Target or Best Buy. There's lots of other companies in this same game, but this is not job creation. This is job destruction.
You notice also that Apple took $820 million under this category subsidy. Amazon $2.9 billion. Of course, Amazon got its leg up over local bookstores when it started because Congress never required their internet sales to be subjected to sales tax. I mean, there's no conceivable ration now why you charge a small bookstore in Idaho a sales tax for books, but not Amazon because it's an online sale. What's the exact nature of this subsidy, though?
So in the case of the Amazon warehouses, it's a lot of property tax abatements and sales tax exemptions when they buy all the stuff to build and equip these places, and then often income tax credits, including even some paying taxes to the boss style things that we know of in a few states. Those are the big ones. And for the data centers, it's sales tax exemptions on all the electricity they buy because they gobble up electricity. And certainly the $820 million in subsidies Apple got, that's a mix of retail, but a lot of cloud computing data center tax breaks too.
Well, also what they're saying is, okay, local state government, we're going to sell online, empty Main Street by replacing brick and mortar stores.
Right.
And to help us make a profit, we want to escape taxation. Isn't that what it's all about?
Yes, absolutely. They want to get paid to gobble up the retail markets.
And then another category you have is end subsidies to data centers.
Mm-hmm.
What's that about?
Well, so this is related. So data centers is where the cloud computing happens, where the cloud resides, and there's hundreds of these things around the country. But basically, once they're built, they're just big rooms full of computer servers. Very, very few permanent jobs, just a few tech people to watch them and security and landscaping and so on. The big expense for them is electricity. Maybe 3/4 of their operating budget is electricity. They use up about 2% of all the electricity in the United States. And yet, states are enacting subsidies to not tax their utilities, to give them big tax breaks. For Washington State, we point out that would be $61 million in gained revenue. Virginia would be $92 million. And again, Amazon's the big dog in this space. They are the dominant cloud computing company. It's a very profitable part of their company. It actually subsidizes their retail side. Why should we pay them to do this?
And they're huge devourers of electricity, aren't they?
Yeah, 2% of all U.S. kilowatts and growing.
Well, let's go to the next one, which is hold schools harmless from giveaways. Schools harmless from giveaways.
So school districts are kind of stepchildren in this whole economic development tax giveaway, tax break industrial complex. They rarely have the power to decide if their taxes are given away, especially their local property taxes. Normally, state law gives that power completely just to cities or counties, even though the most expensive local public service, and therefore the biggest loser in these transactions, is the school district. So we say that's not right. Let's protect schools from the get-go and just say that share of the tax that would normally have gone to the schools is not even on the table. Let's just hold those schools harmless, because there's nothing more fundamental about our long-term prosperity than an educated workforce. We just can't put it at risk. We know already from studies we did, schools in South Carolina would pick up $318 million a year, New York $332 million. And it's also, in this recession now, we know again, states will cut back on their state aid formulas to local school districts. So these local property tax giveaways are going to be more painful than ever, because states are going to be less able to offset these losses.
We're talking with Greg LeRoy, the founder and director of Good Jobs First. And just to take a quick intermission here, how do these companies get away with it? Aren't there these consulting firms that wine and dine local politicians? I mean, it is a huge, systematic, all-court press on these local and state officials.
Yeah, so there is a very deeply enmeshed, I call it the tax break industrial complex. It's more than 80 years old. It dates back to the late 1930s. These consultants you're referring to are called site location consultants. These are kind of the middlemen. They're very secretive. They represent companies running these normally very secret auctions to say, I've got a company. They might create 400 jobs. What have you got for us? I'm not going to tell you who else you're competing with. You can't verify whether or not I'm being truthful when I tell you what the competing bids are. Show me your money and we'll see if you win. It's a captive so-called prisoner's dilemma game for public officials. They're not supposed to cooperate or communicate in any way. They're supposed to passively, put as much money on the table as they can and hope for the best and wait for the site location consultant to deliver or not for them.
And these negotiations, so to speak, are in the shadows. Does the local or state press ever expose this?
Rarely, because the site location consultants enforce non-disclosure agreements, and most states' open records law do not cover negotiations that are in process. So there's no normal, freedom of information way for journalists to get into the system until the whole thing has been hatched and ready to get approved.
So they're exempted from the 50 state freedom of information laws, is what you're saying.
They are.
Let's go to another one of your giveaways. Federal Opportunity Zone capital gains giveaway.
Yeah. So this is a notorious thing that got slipped into the Trump tax cut bill in late 2017. Basically, it was enacted that governors would designate so-called opportunity zones. These are depressed census tracts. There's about 8,700 of them around the country. And if rich people or corporations take capital gains that they have made from other investments and put them into these zones, or put new money into these zones and leave it there for a certain amount of time, they get deep tax cuts on any profits they make, any capital gains profits they make when they pull out of the deals, 7 to 10 years from now. It's basically an end run on the federal capital gains tax. And because most states align with, that is, they're coupled to the way the federal government defines what taxable income is, that means that states passively are losing income too, because the federal so-called adjusted gross income that you compute when you do your federal return, you just take that number and roll it over to your state return as well. And if you're a rich person collecting opportunity zone tax breaks, that means your AGI just went down, and therefore your state AGI just went down. But that doesn't have to be. The states are allowed to decouple and say, no, we're not going to accept passively that giveaway in our definition of what taxable income is. And only 2 states have done that so far, Maryland and North Carolina. New York has just introduced a bill to debate it as well.
And these opportunity zones, they're actually areas, they're acreage in certain metropolitan areas. And they get deregulated in other ways too, right? I mean, a lot of protections are swept aside, environmental, job, and so forth, right?
They're not swept away. They were just never added. That is, there's not a single string attached to these things. You don't have to build one affordable unit of housing. You don't have to create one local job opportunity. You don't have to contract with one minority or women-owned business enterprise. You don't have to do anything necessarily good for the economy to get the tax break.
Well, your last of 10, before we go to a higher level of understanding here, Greg LeRoy, is cap the pre-computer vendor discount. You have vendor discount in quotes.
Yeah. Well, so here, this is a strange thing. It's a vestige from the 1930s when states began enacting sales taxes, and it was a little bit of a burden for merchants to sit down and figure out how much sales tax they had collected, and therefore how much they owed to the state treasury, remitting that sales tax. And so about half the states set up a sort of servicing fee, which is known in Arcania as the vendor discount. That is, the vendors discount the amount of tax they remit to reflect a little bit of servicing costs. But obviously, that makes no sense now, right? Because cash registers are computerized, and the software is built in. If you look up cash registers online, you'll notice it's all streamlined. You can program it for your state, and then bingo, bango, you press a button, and you know how much to send to the state treasury. But a lot of the states never modernized their tax code to reflect this technology, and some states even give a flat rate. That is, like Colorado gives companies 4% of everything they collect, no matter how big that number becomes. So it's losing more than $100 million a year. Illinois, 1.75%, more than $100 million a year. Missouri, more than $100 million a year. This is crazy, huge money. We're failing to reflect the fact that people have computerized cash registers.
This should be an easy one for our listeners to latch on to. Tell our listeners what they can do about something like this in their state and other things, and how you can help them, because we have a serious audience here, and somebody wants to have a feather in their cap, so to speak, and save their home state $50 or $100 million just on that point you mentioned. There might be some action here as a result of this program.
Sure. So at our website, goodjobsfirst.org, under the Accountability Resources tab, you can go to a map of the 50 states, and when you click on that map, you'll get a very robust page about your state. And on that page includes links to our favorite watchdog groups that we work with in state capitals all around the country. You know, we know many states are now going to have very painful budget debates, right? And too much of it's going to be about cuts rather than fixing loopholes. We're arguing, and my whole point of writing this article that we've talked about is to say, before you touch a single salary or lay off a single teacher or whatever, let's fix these corporate giveaway loopholes and take the money to blunt the impact of the recession. So I would urge people to look at those links of groups that are there and connect with them and get on their email list, find out when the legislature debates are coming up, and they can weigh in. There's another group coordinated by the Economic Policy Institute. The website is just earn.us, and you can see at that page also a directory of groups, many of the same groups that we link to on our website, that are the key progressive tax and budget advocacy groups around the United States.
By the way, I'm working off an article that Greg LeRoy wrote called Insight, 10 Steps States Should Take to End Corporate Giveaways, and it was in Bloomberg News, news.bloombergtax.com. Let's go to a higher level here. You say at the beginning of this, U.S. state and localities, I'm quoting you, U.S. state and localities spend an estimated $70 billion, with a B, dollars per year in economic development subsidies, despite decades of evidence that most are wasted. Many are long-term, 10-year property tax abatements, 23-year tax increment financing districts, open-ended corporate income tax credits, and permanent sales tax exemptions. So they leave governments less resilient to cope with extraordinary events like the coronavirus-induced depression we are entering. For some states, such as Louisiana, New Jersey, and Michigan, the collateral damage of overspending on corporate giveaways has long been evident. Lower credit ratings for the states, underfunded schools, distressed infrastructure, and now wheezy public health system. We're in a war to save lives, and we're entering a war to save public services that every family and employer depends on. It's time to clean house on these giveaways, end quote. A very, very important message. Have you gotten on public radio, PBS, or any of the commercial national stations?
Not yet. We've certainly gotten a lot of pickup from activists on this and some public officials who get it. But you're right. I hear what you're saying. And we have, many, many journalists. We have almost 1,000 journalists on our email list. And we were not shy about blasting this message out when it was published. So, obviously COVID is dominating the news cycle right now, but we think that when the budget fights come back, when the special sessions come back, when states resume their legislative sessions, we hope we'll get a higher profile on this. And certainly your listeners will help with that too, I'm sure.
Well, you should contact Joe Donahue, who is the main interviewer of a WAMC public radio in Albany. It has the Governor Cuomo's ear. Paul W. Smith is a legendary morning interviewer for the biggest station in Detroit. So they like state-specific information, which you have all over the 50 states. Overall, how would you reform the gutted, perforated corporate tax system?
I think you get a blowtorch out. I think if you look at these state tax codes, they basically, you can almost map the decades of accreted special interest lobbying. All of these things just get layered on top of each other. And I think we just got to get a blowtorch out and just scrape them out and get back to basics. Tax systems that are fair, that look like they were enacted on purpose, that aren't so profoundly biased against small businesses who obviously need the most help right now, that aren't biased against existing retail businesses, for example, and really focus on public goods where you're not putting lots of eggs in any one basket. You're not putting a lot of eggs in Amazon's basket or Apple's basket or Microsoft's basket, frankly. They don't need the help, and it's risky doing that way anyway.
And one thing you say is, for all these giveaways, what are the states and localities getting for it? Are they getting net jobs? What benefit are they getting? You say it's mostly wasted.
Well, I think it's mostly wasted. I mean, look at the case of Amazon warehouses. We know that the evolution of their prime business model requires them to put warehouses close to wealthy neighborhoods. In fact, on our website, you'll see a link to a story map we recently published where you can zoom in and look at every Amazon warehouse in your metro area, and you'll notice they're very close to wealthy zip codes where all the prime households are, and airports and railheads and truck depots. It's very predictable where they go. So why are we paying them to do it? More than 120 of their warehouses have gotten tax breaks and counting. I mean, they're getting 20 tax break deals a year still, despite the fact that it's obvious they don't need it. But that's why these monies are wasted.
Well, how can people reach all your websites? Give it to them slowly.
That's okay. Yeah, it's goodjobsfirst.org. Again, goodjobsfirst.org. No hyphens, no dots. And you'll see links there to several different toolkits that we have on the website. You'll notice under the accountability resources that we have the 50-state map where you can click through and see everything we have ever published with content about your state in it, including our database results and accountability report card studies and all those good things. You'll also see a button for something called Subsidy Tracker, which is our national database of every disclosed tax break award we've ever been able to collect and then sort it by state and company and so on. You'll see another thing called Tax Break Tracker, which is just about revenues lost to governments. It's based on this new government accounting rule we won. And you'll see another button called Violation Tracker, which I know you also like, Ralph, a lot. It's a regulatory database. For the last 20 years, it captures every federal regulatory agency and puts all the database all in one place. So, for example, we know that banks are the biggest offenders when it comes to so many of these different kinds of federal sanctions, employment-related sanctions, lending sanctions, and so on. But it's also got every form of wage theft, race and sex discrimination, corrupt foreign practices. We now know, for example, who the big companies are that have ripped off Medicare, and some of those companies are now getting CARES Act money. And then, of course, we've got the website that you mentioned right at the top of the period, Ralph, which is covidstimuluswatch.org. No www, just covidstimuluswatch, all one word, no dashes, .org. That's our brand new database. It's only been up about 3 weeks. where we're capturing all the data now being put out through the CARES Act, that is the federal law to stimulate the economy to try to get to blunt the depression. We've got a modest amount of data there right now because the big data dumps have not come out yet from the Treasury Department or the Small Business Administration.
Listeners, this is a spectacular database for corporate crime, naming companies, by the way,
Yes.
and the need for much tougher and bigger corporate crime prosecution budgets at the state and federal level.
And supporting your longstanding demand, Ralph, that the Justice Department start keeping a database on white-collar crime,
which they constantly avoid under both Democrat and Republican administrations. We've met with attorney generals on that point. They have street crime database, but not
Right.
corporate crime database.
Right.
Listeners, if this seems a bit too much to act on, one thing you can do is if you happen to know a business professor at a local community college or four-year college who's fairly enlightened, maybe you can collaborate with that person to get these issues on the front burner in your state or your community. And you've got this wonderful database. It's a national geographic of corporate giveaways. And use it. Good jobs first. Use it.
In support of what you're saying, Ralph, don't let these things overwhelm you with their complexity. The corporate giveaway artists have intentionally tried to make these things sound overly complicated and bury you in lingo and acronyms to intimidate people about not questioning them. At their core, these things are not that hard to understand, and they are every bit as outrageous and unjust as I'm explaining to you. And when you boil these down, it's impossible to defend them, frankly.
As one prosecutor once said a few years ago, who was handling a complex tax violation, he said, when you strip out all of its jargon, it's all about lying, cheating, and stealing. I think that's what you're saying.
I really do, and I think that, it's all gussied up and pinstriped, but at the end of the day, it's really unfair, and we can't afford it anymore, frankly. We got many more important things to do with that money.
Well, at the conclusion here, you've written a book. Why don't you tell us about it, and then we'll have to conclude. Our time is up.
Sure. So I wrote a book 15 years ago, my second book, called The Great American Job Scam. It's available soon on sale by my publisher at bkpub.com. But you can see the whole book for free online at our website at goodjobsfirst.org. So you go, again, to goodjobsfirst.org, and you just add a backslash and then 4 letters, GAJS. And the publisher has his own personal statement as a small businessman protesting the unfairness of the system, has been allowing me to give away that book for many years.
Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with the estimable Greg LeRoy, founder and director of Good Jobs First. The website's goodjobsfirst.org. And now you perhaps realize, dear listeners, why no corporate freeloaders ever want to debate Greg LeRoy. Thank you very much, Greg.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much again.
We've been speaking with Greg LeRoy. He is the founder of Good Jobs First, and you can look at how the CARES Act money is being distributed at covidstimulus.watchdog.org. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue on this theme and talk about how states can raise revenue for the essential services they provide us. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your corporate crime report on Morning Minute for Friday, May 22, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Journalist Gerald Posner is out with a new book titled Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. It's published by Simon & Schuster. The book traces the heroes and the villains of the trillion-dollar-a-year pharmaceutical industry and uncovers how those once entrusted with improving life have often betrayed that ideal to corruption and reckless profiteering with deadly consequences. Pharmaceutical breakthroughs such as antibiotics and vaccines rank among some of the greatest advancements in human history, yet exorbitant prices for life-saving drugs, safety recalls affecting tens of millions of Americans, and soaring rates of addiction and overdose on prescription opioids have caused many to lose faith in drug companies. And now Americans are demanding a national reckoning with a monolithic industry. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman. And Ralph, Bernie Sanders has been a longtime supporter of reinstating the stock transfer tax. This has not happened yet, of course, but if it did, this tax on the extremely wealthy could generate $13 billion a year for New York State alone. David?
Phil Steck is a Democratic member of the New York State Assembly. Since graduating from law school, Mr. Steck has focused on civil rights and employment law in order to make sure big business and special interests couldn't take away working people's rights. His main legislative interests include single-payer health insurance, rebuilding upstate New York infrastructure, and increasing funding for public education. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Phil Steck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. When I first talked to you, you reminded me that I spoke at your Harvard University undergraduate commencement speech.
Yes, I remember it very well. It was outside in the yard.
And you've been a longtime member of the Assembly in New York, and we're now in New York State at a very critical situation because of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Governor Cuomo has announced enormous cuts. I think the figure is reaching $13.3 billion, and there are going to be cuts on localities and state services. That includes public education, mass transit, healthcare, and other critical services for the people of the state of New York. Now, unlike all other states, the state of New York since 1981 has been rebating automatically, electronically, an estimated $16 billion a year from a stock transfer cost. This is a tiny, tiny sales tax on people who buy stocks, bonds, and of course the huge volume is in the options and derivatives market. And this tax is collected and then rebated under some agreement with the brokerage industry. It amounts to tens of millions of dollars a day, which can be used to offset Governor Cuomo's tax cuts. You have proposed a bill in the state assembly and your counterparts in the state senate, a similar bill, to do what?
To end the rebate and reinstate the stock transfer tax, which New York had from 1905 to 1981. And just like in every other country in the world, which has these financial transaction taxes, it never caused the slightest bit of harm to the economy or to Wall Street. I think one of the critical things to understand is that this is not a tax on Wall Street. It is just a tax that Wall Street collects. So it's like going to the store and paying a sales tax. If the tax is low enough, the customer doesn't care and buys the product anyway. And here we're talking about a tax that's 1/4%.
And the volume is so massive that the New York State share of that is about $16 billion. Now, people in New York State, they go into stores on Main Street and they buy necessities and they pay 6, 7, 8% sales tax because New York City has a sales tax, I understand, in addition to the state. And now here are these brokers who don't even pay the tax. They pass it on to the investors, and the investors that will pay most of this tax are the rich because they're the ones who trade the most and they're the ones who own the most equities and bonds and play the derivatives market. So it is a progressive sales tax, and it's automatically collected and then electronically sent back every day. What's the reason behind that kind of zigzag?
Well, what happened was in the late 70s, New York City was in financial crisis, and they diverted the revenue from the stock transfer tax, which New York had been collecting since 1905. They diverted it to help bail out New York City from its financial crisis. And as New York City came out of the financial crisis, the mayor of New York at that time, Abraham Bean, was persuaded by people that on Wall Street that once New York emerged from the financial crisis, the tax should no longer be collected. So at about a rate of 20% over a 5-year period per year, the tax was ended in sum and substance. And that is the origin of this rebate. So you're right, the tax is still on the books. It's calculated, but not collected.
Well, what's Governor Cuomo, who is engaging in very popular daily briefings? He's showing Trump up every day. What's his problem with this? He's very concerned about the tax cuts, and the legislature has given him extraordinary authority to actually do the cuts subject to a override resolution from the legislature.
Which, by the way, I voted no on.
Yeah, well,
yes, go on.
That's right. I mean, it's a huge abdication, in my judgment, of legislative authority under the New York State Constitution. Okay, so he's going to make these cuts. They're not going to be popular. People are going to resent it. They may blame him in part for it. Why is he resisting just keeping the tens of millions of dollars every day that is collected?
So I think this actually is something that we have to grapple with the Democratic Party as a whole. The Democratic Party is kind of stuck in a 1980 mindset. Now, Ronald Reagan became president, government was bad, all taxes are bad, and anything that's a tax, we have to avoid it at all possible costs. I think Cuomo comes out of that milieu. He was in the Clinton administration when that thinking was popular, and he has said that he doesn't want to damage a successful sector of the New York State economy, namely the financial industry, by putting in this tax. That was his simple answer. And the reality is that every single major exchange in the world, except Germany, and Germany has proposed a stock transfer tax at the end of 2019, every other major exchange has it. And as Bloomberg News itself said in an op-ed piece, that Hong Kong's had it. It's known by the capitalist system as one of the freest markets in the world, and there has been no noticeable adverse effect on the economy because Hong Kong Exchange has a financial transactions tax. So Governor Cuomo he hasn't studied the issue, and he is stuck in a 40-year-old mindset, in my opinion.
Well, it's an indirect tax. The brokers don't feel it because they pass it on mostly to the fat cats. Just to bring it down to basics here, somebody buys a $25 stock.
Yeah.
How much is this tax amount to?
So on $25, it could even be less because there are different tiers of the tax. But let's assume $25 is taxed at the highest rate, which is 0.0025. We'd say 25 times 0.0025, that's 6-7 cents. So the way I like to say it, because I'm an ordinary, middle-class guy like most Americans who are fortunate to have decent jobs, I have a 401k plan. I buy about $20,000 of shares a year in my 401k plan, and my tax would be $50. Meanwhile, I'm paying all kinds of asset management fees, brokerage fees, financial advisor fees, and those fees, which make the industry as wealthy as it is, the stock transfer tax pales in comparison to the fees collected by the industry. And I would point out that we had a New York State comptroller who was sentenced to jail because he was basically giving into bribes to allow certain companies to participate in the New York State pension plan. They wouldn't do that if it wasn't extremely lucrative to get into this business. So the stock transfer tax is very harmless to everyone involved. Economists will tell you that a financial transaction tax is actually good for the market because it does discourage day trading, which is people who trade based on very slight movements in the stock. The purpose of the market is to have investment. It's not to gamble on slight movements of stock, and therefore economists say that the stock transfer tax is helpful because it deters that. And as Bloomberg News pointed out, in Hong Kong, which has the tax, there's less of that day trading than there is in New York.
Yeah, it sort of dampens the wild speculation. That's a very important comparative point you just made with all the fees and charges that the industry puts on the investors. They tower over this transaction tax. But this transaction tax, the stock transfer tax, will bring in about $16 billion, which takes care of the COVID-19 induced state budget. I mean, it's an amazing winner, and I think you're going to win the battle because, first of all, Robert Rubin, Mr. Wall Street, has come out for a financial transaction tax. Mike Bloomberg has come out for a financial transaction tax. This would have been unheard of 2 years ago. We can thank Bernie Sanders for this. And now there's a big coalition in your state, Phil, of citizen groups about to emerge supporting your legislation. And so the next step is public hearings in Albany. Is that possible?
Well, this would be within the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee. And I did send a letter to Ways and Means about this, urging that staff conduct inquiry of a serious kind into the tax and not rely on dogma from 40 years ago. I had some conversations with the leading staff member at Ways and Means about it. But the history of our legislature in my time that we've been there has not been very favorable towards meaningful public hearings. So I think that is an excellent idea. And of course, the industry would have its opportunity to have someone come or people come and talk against it. But we might find there are some people in the industry, as you pointed out, who support it. You know, there really is no real potential adverse impact from this thing, and it would raise the money. And I want to make a political point for New Yorkers. In my district, and a lot of the key Long Island districts, which hold the balance of power in the Senate, the key issue for people is public education. If people have a choice between a stock transfer tax, which 90% of them don't pay, and 20% cuts to public education, I know that they would want the stock transfer tax. And interestingly, I had a conversation with a Long Island member of the Assembly, a very well-respected member, who agreed 100% with that political perspective. Unfortunately, Governor Cuomo has not been a huge supporter of public education. He has been sort of, I have to say, you know, my hat's off to the Assembly, because every year we fight for funding for public education, and we have been overcoming the governor. But the governor has not been a big supporter of increasing aid to public education. And now, of course, I don't think the cut to public education troubles the governor much in comparison to how troubled my constituents would be by it.
Well, if you have a public hearing in Albany, it's going to be packed with people who are having to endure these Cuomo announced cuts. You're going to have people representing the mass transit, people representing education, people who don't want to see Medicaid cut. All kinds of people will flood that hearing room. And I think Governor Cuomo puts his finger to the wind like any politician, and he will, I think, come to grips that he can eliminate this budget deficit with simply keeping the taxes that come from the stock transfer tax. I think this is a winning battle you're engaged in. We're talking with Assemblyman Phil Steck, who is the sponsor of a bill to keep the collected taxes. Can you imagine? Keep the collected taxes and not electronically, automatically rebate it day after day back to Wall Street. Can the governor do this on his own authority?
That's a good question. I do know he was given the authority to cut the budget. I think that if it was related to COVID-19, I think a strong argument can be made that he does have the authority to collect the tax.
Is an opinion from the state attorney general?
No one that I know of has asked for that opinion.
That would be good, because it would put the spotlight on his own authority as governor of the state of New York, simply to say, well, the tax is duly collected and it's rebated, and he issues an order saying it's going to be kept in order to provide the needed services for the people of the state of New York. I think he'd be a hero
to the public if he did that, and to the New York State economy.
Well, I think with your counterpart, State Senator Sanders, who has a similar bill, and you also list in the bill, I understand, where this money would go. And it happens to be going to exactly where the cuts are because of the COVID-19 crisis.
Well, our bill puts it all into infrastructure. The one area which we were not funding with it previously, that two areas that are significant were Medicaid and public education, which were the two largest expenditures of New York State government. The reason we did that, because it was before COVID-19, before the economic problems that we've had now.
It was last year your bill was
Yes,
introduced.
that's correct. We did it that way because we have a deteriorating infrastructure in the state of New York, especially public transportation and public housing. But now I think we would want to put it into the general fund to address the COVID-19. And then, it would help us come out of this depression. And then we could fund all these wonderful infrastructure projects and, make New York State the Empire State again. I mean, Ralph, you had talked earlier on your program about all these giveaways, these tax giveaways. If you have the stock transfer tax and the government is investing in directly in infrastructure, the high quality of New York infrastructure will attract business to the state. What made New York State the Empire State was a very famous infrastructure project known as the Erie Canal. It's no different today. If you build up the high-tech, the green infrastructure, and we had 15% of the revenue in our bill to green infrastructure, if you build that up in our state, it will make this state once again an economic powerhouse. And in return, Wall Street will get some of the benefit back from that.
Phil, tell our listeners the number of the bill and where they can get a copy.
Okay, well, it's available online. It's A7791. That bill in the Senate version is Senate 06203. And you can get a copy of that bill on my Assembly website, which is, and there's a button for legislation. But if you go to the New York State Assembly website and you click on my page and go to legislation, you will see that bill there. You can read the bill itself. You can read the bill memorandum. All bills have to have a memorandum that states the reason for the bill. And that memorandum also lists all the places where the money was intended to go before the COVID-19. And there's some great stuff in there. New York doesn't have a fund for safe water. We put $650 million out of the stock transfer tax into safe water. Amtrak has a lot of problems. It's shocking when you go from Buffalo to Albany. They're trying to run trains on one track. When you get to Syracuse, one train coming from the west and one train coming from the east. One has to stop and wait for the other to pass. It's unbelievable. So we put money in $1.3 billion to fix that. There's all kinds of stuff in there. Almost $2 billion for clean energy, for example.
Well, this is a wonderful initiative. I can't believe this one is going to be anything other than a winner in the next few months, because when these budget cuts hit home in New York State, upstate, downstate, Long Island, New York City, there's going to be an uproar. And the moment they hear about $16 billion being rebated back to the fat cats of Wall Street, who are not being asked to sacrifice anything compared to the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, the grocery workers, the sanitation workers, the public transit workers who are risking their health and safety, I think the polls are going to come in over 90%.
Across the board, even among Republicans, because in my district, a lot of the Republicans that I have in my district are not wealthy people. They're working people. And I have never heard much opposition from anyone to this proposal. It's very, very popular.
Where's your district located?
So my district is, I have the town of Colony, which is the largest suburb in Albany County. I also have Niskayuna, a suburb of Schenectady, and the city of Schenectady.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Assemblyman Phil Steck, who is a prime sponsor of a bill in the Assembly, and there's one in the state Senate, and it would have huge popular support, to keep $16 billion in stock transfer tax. That's just a tiny sales tax on financial transactions back in New York to meet the public services that are about to be cut because of the COVID-19 virus crisis. Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you, Ralph, for having me and for your support.
Now, as promised, we close today with some highlights of the late, great David Freeman from past episodes of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Hit it, Jimmy.
Why are we fooling around with cap and trade and taxes and all kind of cockamamie schemes when all we need to do is to pass a simple one-sentence law. Everything new has to be greenhouse gas free and renewable. Why don't we outlaw any new power plant other than the solar and the wind? And why don't we mandate that the railroads electrify over a 10-year? Why don't we pass some damn laws to require what the public interest demands? I divide the world into two categories now. There are the dumb deniers of climate, and then there are the intelligent deniers. They are the folks that can make a good speech about how horrible the climate crisis is and then propose absolutely nothing that is going to make that Mother Nature will notice. There are two existential threats to mankind, and we talk a lot about climate, which is one of them, but the other one is nuclear proliferation and nuclear accidents. And the problem is fossil fuels. It's 70% of the greenhouse gases being emitted. And the answer is old-fashioned. We need to outlaw the goddamn stuff. We talk about green jobs. The green jobs are in building. But once you've built a windmill, a wind farm, or a solar farm, you have virtually zero fuel costs. If we went to public power, we would dramatically reduce the price of energy as well as save our planet.
That's the great S. David Freeman. We will miss you, but we will carry on the fight. I want to thank our guests again, Greg LeRoy and Phil Steck. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
He will be, I missed him. He was great. Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our intern is Michaela Squire. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and listeners. Take heed and start these Congress watchdog groups. You can get a good start by ordering How the Rats Reformed the Congress. Go to ratsreformcongress.org and join your fellow citizens in getting copies for neighborhood discussions in action.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. First, we continue our conversation with Greg LeRoy of Good Jobs First about more corporate tax giveaways and also the origin of his activism.
Well, Breathless Stephen and David, do you have any comments to say here?
What would the stock market look like if we didn't have these tax subsidies, these tax breaks? What would corporate profits look like, roughly speaking?
Yeah, some companies would pay substantially higher taxes. That's both a federal issue, obviously, because federal income taxes are much, much bigger than state income taxes. But at the local level, property taxes are actually the biggest tax most companies pay. A lot of people don't realize that. And so if companies actually paid their local property taxes, it would be real big money. And, it would also change the way development happens, too, frankly. We're incentivizing, too much real estate development, too much retail development. I wrote a book 15 years ago in which I made the point that on a per capita basis, the United States had several times more square feet of retail space than any other industrial democracy in the world. We're way overbuilt. We have lots of dying malls. There's a whole art and, practice out there about repurposing dead malls. And that was true 15 years ago. Now it's like they're falling off a cliff rapidly, right? And the bricks and mortar chains are, one a week it's declaring bankruptcy because we were way overbuilt. And all those projects got big subsidies, big sales tax breaks, big property tax break, big infrastructure subsidies, even though it was way overbuilt.
Very inefficient as a strategy to begin with.
And wasteful, environmentally wasteful, terrible land use patterns resulting from that. Auto-oriented development, malls, big box stores.
Listeners might be interested in the following question, Greg. How did you come to this kind of work? I mean, this is a really amazing group, listeners, Good Jobs First. And Greg just has such incredible information that can devolve right down to the local civic level, town meetings and city councils and these kinds of neighborhood groups that are being deprived of public services because of the drain on the tax collection of these fat corporations. How did you come to this work?
Well, you have to blame it on Play School. I was working for a nonprofit group in Chicago in 1984. We were trying to prevent factory closings. We were working with a lot of unions and hard-hit communities in that time when the term Rust Belt had been coined, and a book called The Deindustrialization of America was on the bestseller lists. And Play School, which had a big factory on the west side of Chicago, announced it was going to move all the jobs to Rhode Island, even though the city of Chicago had given a big loan, a big cheap loan to Play School to modernize and upgrade and supposedly secure the jobs on the west side of Chicago. Of course, this was during the Harold Washington mayoral years, and everybody went crazy. They said, "We can't believe this. What happened to that subsidy we gave you? Why didn't it secure the jobs?" And although we weren't able to force the company to reconsider on that case, that really launched a whole spate of disputes about companies abusing tax breaks and other kinds of incentives in plant closing disputes. And we actually stopped the big factory shutdown in Minnesota a few years later. We won a big judgment in Indiana a few years after that. We almost prevailed against General Motors in Michigan a few years after that. It really spawned a whole backlash against abusive tax breaks, and that was my accidental career.
Well, tell us what a clawback of these subsidies means. And is there ever clawbacks where they have to rebate what they took because they didn't fulfill their contractual promises for workers?
Yes, there is. In fact, that's exactly what Chicago and lots of other states and cities did in the wake of these disputes I'm describing. They said, well, maybe we didn't, the fine print let the company take the money and run in this case, but we've got to fix that law to prevent anybody from doing that to us again. And so they enacted what are called clawbacks, literally money-back guarantee language, saying that for the life of this subsidy, the 10-year property tax break or the 10-year loan or whatever, you can't move those jobs and those assets away. You got to keep them here, or else you pay the money back tied to the amount you lost. The other big positive is that many states have just changed the whole structure of their incentives to say, to backload them. That is to say, you're not going to get anything from government until you, the company, deliver on your end of the deal. You hire the people, you spend the money, and then after the fact, we'll give you what we promised.
I don't know why small businesses don't invoke the equal protection of the law under the Constitution. For example, they're on Main Street and they're selling. They don't get these subsidies. And then along comes giants like Amazon and Walmart, and they get subsidies. Why isn't that a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
You're the lawyer, not me. I completely agree, though. I think that small businesses have been grossly misrepresented by the National Federation of Independent Businesses and by many local chambers of commerce in this country on this issue. It's not a secret that in some states, local chambers of commerce actually play the role of economic development. They actually get contracts from local governments. They actually subsist on incentive dollars, in some cases, to do the recruitment instead of local government. So they're very tied into this whole system of incentives and tax breaks. But you're right, small businesses are roadkill for the big boys that get the big bucks here. And we've actually done studies looking at this too, saying even if you take a program that's theoretically open to a company of every size and therefore should look like the state's employer base, but then you say who actually did get the deals in dollars, well, 70% of the deals, 90% of the dollars go into big multi-state, multinational companies.
Who start so-called new businesses. So old businesses who've been faithful to the community for years and sending their tax dollars to local school districts, they get the wrong end of the stick, so to speak.
That's exactly right. And I tip my hat, for example, to the 17 business leaders in Kansas City that finally prevailed there. The Hall family of the Hallmark Card Company, it's now publicly known, were the ringleaders of that group that won that victory.
Now David asks a question of New York Assemblyman Phil Steck.
We've been speaking with Assemblyman Phil Steck. That's S-T-E-C-K, for those of you who want to contact him. We've been speaking with him about keeping $16 billion that is already collected day after day under the stock transfer tax law, so as these budget cuts need not have such a draconian impact on so many millions of innocent New Yorkers and families. David, Steve, any comments?
The financial sector has grown disproportionately compared to all the other sectors of our economy. These tax transfers, these the churning, the trading that we see with institutional investors, they don't create anything other than fees. Is there a way to increase the tax and reduce the size of the financial sector? Shouldn't that be the goal?
I think, first of all, the transfer tax that we proposed, the 0.25%, you'd have to really ask economists what the right number would be if we were going to increase it. I would note that London, which is a very successful exchange, has a transfer tax from 0.5% to 1.5% without any adverse effect on the London market. So yes, it could be done. We are trying, because so much has changed. A lot more stock is publicly traded. A lot less companies are privately held. Also, there's a lot of new, as Ralph pointed out at the start of the show, there's a lot of new financial vehicles that are not subject to tax under this current, under the 1905 legislation.
You're talking about private equity, the threat of private equity doing things sub rosa.
Well, yeah, private equity would be subject to tax under this, but it would have to be, even if it was privately done, it would have to be, in order not to be subject to the tax, it would have to not involve any residents of New York State, which would be unlikely, given the structure now. The argument is made that, well, they would move out of New York City. That is absurd because, first of all, the firms don't pay the tax, as we've pointed out before. But also, being in New York City, being in the financial capital of the world, gives you access to a lot of contacts and other advantages that you're not going to have in Topeka, Kansas. So, we've heard that argument before, but New York never taxed private transactions that took place in other states. There's enough activity here in New York to provide the benefit that Ralph was talking about to the government of the state and our economy.
And now we have a short interview exchange with Phil Steck.
I don't know. It seems like such a slam dunk in terms of you have the evidence, you have the principle, you have the popularity. If you were gaming this out, and saying, okay, what could possibly go wrong? What do you see as the biggest obstacle to this?
So the biggest obstacle is ideology. It's this concept, which I mentioned, that the Democratic Party, and I think this is true nationwide, is stuck in a 1980 mindset. It really is true. And I think we can't underestimate the power of corporate propaganda over the last 40 years. I mean, we saw in the Democratic primary that Bernie, and I'm a Bernie delegate, and so was James Sanders, he couldn't overcome that with people of my baby boomer generation. He couldn't overcome that corporate propaganda, even with all the money that he raised, because it had been drilled in people's heads for so long.
It's Reagan, the Reagan era.
It's the Reagan era thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and all Donald Trump is Ronald Reagan on steroids. That's all it is.
He's the id of Ronald Reagan. It's Ronald Reagan was too polite to say the thing.
It's Ronald Reagan on Adderall.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really it's a it's a bad situation, and we should be talking about the principles of the New Deal. I did a tweet the other day where I said that Andrew Cuomo may drive around in the Roosevelt car, which, he took it out of the State Museum and drove it around. Honest to God, I said, but he's no FDR. And what we need is an FDR type philosophy. Andrew Cuomo, he doesn't have policy people around him. He largely has yes men and corporate sycophants. And, it's total in contrast to the Roosevelt Brains Trust, because I do a lot of reading about Roosevelt, and of course he didn't know exactly what to do in light of the Great Depression, and he listened to various people. But what made him great was his ability to have the intelligence to understand what this new wave of economists were saying, and ultimately that's where he went. Cuomo is stuck in 1980. He's stuck in the Clinton administration and can't seem to free himself of that.
Well, there's a new era coming on the backs of the deadly COVID-19 virus, which is changing all kinds of mindsets about the role of government and the proper burden of taxation on the rich and powerful and corporate. And I think you're riding the crest on this, Phil.
Well, I want to thank you also for having on the show, and I'm going to look that up. That man from the Good Jobs
Greg LeRoy.
First.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
he'll be a great asset to you. And Blair Horner is going to have up to 50 groups on this petition.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You're going to have huge support. You won't have enough chairs in the assembly room to begin allowing the crowd to come in. Okay, well, this is great, Phil. Let's stay in touch. You're going to
thank you so much. Yes, we will be.
Come alive on this.
Yeah, I like to really follow this story and see if everything we're hoping it happens.
Well, doing the show was great. It energized me. I got to call I got to do an hour-long program with the Girl Scouts, and then I'm calling them my chief of staff.
Okay. And by the way, this is all bubbling up without the New York Times or the major press on. Once they get on it, Cuomo will feel the heat. You remember how he was congenial to fracking, and then he saw the rumble from the people, and he turned against fracking.
Well, the Assembly was very good on fracking, much better than it's been on this, because we did a moratorium initially. We had that legislation was being passed every year, but on this, we have not been good. And I voted no on the revenue bill this year and gave a talk about that. This was the reason why.
Well, great. Well, as Steve said, we're going to follow this up, and we'll make a lot of calls on your behalf on this in the state.
Thank you so much.
Okay. And good luck with the Girl Scouts. They're tough. They're gonna get you buying cookies. You're gonna get fat. Believe me, I know. I've been there.
All right, take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Finally, we wrap up with Ralph answering a listener question.
All right, let's do a listener question, David.
This comes to us from Howard Lazzarini. He says, Ralph, I love the show, but I wanted to take issue with something that Ralph said. He said that nobody is forming congressional watchdog groups or putting pressure on our members of Congress. He must not know about groups like Indivisible. Our group here in Snohomish County, Washington, meets monthly with our reps and our staffers, presenting a long list of items that we are asking them to address. Climate change, vote by mail, immigration, ICE, detention centers, Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and the list goes on. We have sponsored, together with other groups like 350.org and Guns Down, mass rallies in our county. We also work to identify and support local progressive candidates, including phone banking and door knocking. So perhaps instead of just blasting citizens for not doing anything, he should urge his listeners to get involved with one of these groups that are meeting with their members of Congress and taking action to make their voices heard. Your fan, Howard Lazzarini.
Thank you, Howard. It's true, there are chapters of Indivisible all around the country, and they're in varying degrees doing what Howard described. But the Congress watchdog groups are more formidable. They involve full-time staff in each congressional district and much more powerful techniques to summons a member of Congress on agendas. So your group is a start. I'm glad you've fed back what you're doing. I've been asking people for years now to feedback on whether they're starting a Congress watchdog group. And so you have fed back, and that's what I want other people to do. So good luck. I might add that when Indivisible started with the two former staffers in Congress who left and started Indivisible right after Trump was selected by the Electoral College, we tried to get a hold of them, and call after call, email after call. We could never get them to return calls in the subsequent months. So maybe one thing you can do for communication, Howard, is to tell the people at the top of this decentralized citizen initiative to call other citizen groups back so they can work together.
Very good. Thank you for your question, Howard.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome back Jim Zirin, who is going to update us on Donald Trump's lawsuits. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.